Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for our October study group. This month, we're going to be looking at identity and access management. So thank you very much to everybody who voted to study this topic. This month, you've also voted to study single sign-on with SAML, and Charly has very kindly volunteered to take us through this topic in a bit more. Feel free, if you want to ask any questions, do ask questions in the chat. We also have Andy, who's joined us. He's a CTA, and he has offered to handle any questions as well. So thank you very much to Andy for giving up your time to join us this afternoon / evening / whichever time zone everybody's on. So I'm just going to move on. So Charly, if you want to change slides. Okay, so introducing Charly. Charly is our one of our 3 co-leaders for Ladies Be Architects, and this is probably about the 3rd or 4th session that she's done for us. So thank you, Charly. Charly and I are all on the journey to the review board now. So we're just finishing up and some of our final certs and practicing in earnest for the review board. So this is a really good opportunity for Charly as well to practice conveying her own knowledge about single sign-on. So I'm sure she's very grateful for that opportunity. If you want to follow Charly on Twitter, her Twitter handle's there, Charly Prinsloo, and she's planning to do CPQ next. Should we go to the next slide, Charly? Okay, so here's a picture of everybody at Dreamforce. We wanted to say thank you to all of you for all of your continued support. And I don't know about you guys, but we had an absolute blast at Dreamforce. I don't know if you know, but there were not that many of us who had met each other in person at Dreamforce. Were we actually ready for this photo to be taken? I don't know, but still a pretty say. Charly, do you want to say anything about Dreamforce?
I wanted to put this on here. It was amazing to be able to take a Ladies Be Architect photograph. And we were all being silly. I know Gemma, there's quite a few versions of this photo out there in the world. But it was an immense pleasure and honor to meet each one of you and to spend time with you. And I'm really sad Dreamforce is over, and I can't wait for the next one.
Susanna, do you want to say anything about Dreamforce? He's on mute.
Hey everyone, yeah, thanks so much, Gemma. So at Dreamforce, I had the opportunity to meet Gemma for the first time, and Charly as well, and was so thrilled to sort of formally be asked to join as a co-lead of Ladies Be Architects. I think we had some amazing sessions as well, and we'll be posting out those recordings and slides into the chatter of the sessions and getting that content out to you guys as well. So it was a pleasure to meet everyone, and thanks so much for all that you're doing to support Ladies Be Architects.
Lynn says she wishes she'd been there, but maybe you won't have to wait too long, Lynn, because we are always keeping our eye out on the community conferences that are going on. So hopefully we'll get to meet you there. So far we've got a few October champions. We've got Elena, who actually achieved application architect. So congratulations to Elena. We also have Jessica, who got sharing and visibility designer, and Kerry, a lovely friend of ours, who got development lifecycle and deployment designer. We also had one person who got application architect today, right before our meeting this afternoon. So I'm just going to share who that is because I've got it in another tab. And what we would like to ask you to do is, if you are a champion, do send us a private message with your mailing address, because we do like to send people something in the. Lynn actually got application architect today, so congratulations, Lynn.
Amazing.
And she's on the call. So do send us your mailing address. We'll send you a present.
Okay.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Charly now. I'm going to be quiet and let Charly get on with the session. So if you have any questions, do let us know, and take it away. Thank you, Charly.
Thank you so much. My connection seems to be going in and out. I don't know if it's mine or something else, but if you guys can't hear me, let me know so that I can do something about it. So as Gemma was saying, today's study material is helping with the Identity and Access Management Designer. And I just wanted to put this badge very big on this page so that we can just focus on why are we learning all of this stuff, is so that we can ultimately get certified and reach and climb this mountain and reach the top. So today I want to talk to you about single sign-on. We talk about the terminology. What is it? How does it work? How do you set it up? How do you test it and troubleshoot it? Some next steps, some great resources, and then a call to action for each one of you. So I promise it's going to be, I don't promise it's going to be fun, but I promise you'll learn something today. If you have any questions, post them in the chat. I can't see the chat, but Gemma is going to moderate, and we can just interrupt me and we'll go through the questions. So terminology, single sign-on, SSO. It allows users to sign on in one website or system and automatically be signed on in another website or system. For example, a user could sign onto your internal intranet site. So you log into your work computer as you normally do, and then you click a link or a button or a tab to access Salesforce, and then you don't have to sign in again. You are automatically signed in. We use this every day in so many different ways. Once you start seeing and recognizing it, it's really interesting to try and follow the URLs in the browser and see if you can figure out what's going on. The second one is SAML. SAML is the abbreviation for Security Assertion Markup Language. Now, in order for SSO to be secure, the system that receives the login request has to be able to verify the source of those requests so that they can make sure that it's valid, right? So example, Salesforce has a server, and this server has to verify the source of those requests to ensure that they are valid. Salesforce has to make sure that they really come from your internet server. So SAML is a standard data format used for exchanging the data between the two parties in SSO. It's a protocol, it's a standard. We'll talk about SAML in the next slide a little bit more, because it's really important to understand what SAML is and what it looks like. And then the SAML metadata, this is the metadata used to make SAML work, and it's usually provided by the IDP. That's important to remember. What is the IDP? That's the identity provider. An IDP is the mechanism that validates the users trying to access a website using single sign-on. For example, when users access Salesforce from their company's intranet site, an IDP will verify whether those users have valid Salesforce user account before allowing them to automatically be presented with Salesforce and be logged in. And then service provider. A service provider is a company or an entity that provides those web services. In case of Salesforce, your service provider supplies the Salesforce URL or the custom domain that the IDP redirects to. Identity management, IDM. The information system, or it could be a set of technologies that manages individual identities, their authentication, their authorization, the roles and privileges within or across systems and enterprises. So it's really important that it's your IDM that provides the authorization. And we'll talk about that in a minute as well. Then another term that I want you guys to focus on is deep linking. It's using a URL to access a website or a piece of information or an application without having to go through the homepage first. We've all received those community emails from Salesforce with the URL link in to reply. And when you click on it, when you use single sign-on, you'll be automatically signed into the org, and it'll take you to that conversation or that chatter post where you want to reply, instead of you having to just be logged in and you have to go search for it. The next term is relay state. Relay state is the parameter that we use in order to be able to do deep linking. So when you try and access a Salesforce page by clicking on a deep link, instead of taking you to the default homepage, the SSO passes to the identity provider the URL that you are linking to through the relay state parameter. The SAML relay state parameter is an optional configuration with most identity management systems and is required to be implemented on the IDP for deep linking to be supported. So if you have a separate IT part from your Salesforce part in your company, which I see so often, you have to go speak to those IT guys managing the IDP so that you can make sure that it's done on the IDP as well. So that was just the terminology. Any questions on this? Gemma, anything come up?
No, I would say you're cutting in just a slightly, just in and out. So just to let you, you're talking slowly enough that we're able to follow. So thank you.
Okay. All right, apologies for that. So this is a flashback slide for those of you that attended the OAuth sessions with me in the beginning of the year. We talked about the different identity standards and protocols that Salesforce uses. And we identified them as SAML, OAuth 2.0, and OpenID Connect. So in the OAuth sessions, we talked about OAuth. Today, we're talking about SAML. So here's our first clue. SAML is one of the 3 protocols in order to do identity management in Salesforce. So what is SAML? We said it's the security assertion markup language, and it's an XML-based identity protocol. So what does it mean if it's XML-based? It means it's written in XML. XML is very human readable, or most of the time, so that when you look at it, you can get a really good idea of what it is conveying. It is based on an OASIS standard, so it's a worldwide standard. And something too important to remember, SAML doesn't do authorization, but OAuth does. You'll remember from the OAuth sessions, OAuth is all about authorization. I'm giving my son permission to take the car. If you don't understand that analogy, go watch those videos. Whereas SAML doesn't do authorization. The assertion mechanism with SAML is a SAML token. It's not a certificate, it's a SAML token. And with SAML, you can transfer user information between the 2 services, such as Salesforce to another service provider, and it's supported by all editions of Salesforce. So on the screen, you have an example of SAML, and just by kind of reading through it, you can see there's a username. We can see it says a name ID, and then we can see the name ID is user101 at Salesforce. We can see its confirmation, subject confirmation method. We can see the confirmation data. So it's human readable, and when you look at a full piece of SAML, it's really easy to see where the parameters come from. So we know what SAML is. It's basically like a assertion language, a way that we write the assertion so that all the systems can understand it, so that when we do the verification, what is single sign-on then? Single sign-on is the process that lets users access authorized network resources with one login. You validate usernames and passwords against your corporate user database or another user database, and instead of Salesforce having to manage all the separate passwords for each resource, or instead of you having to remember passwords for every single service that you subscribe to. So Salesforce offers the following ways to use SSO. The first way is Federated Authentication SSO, and that uses SAML. The second way is Delegated Authentication Single Sign-On, and that is with an authentication method that you choose. And the third way is authentication providers. So today, we will only focus on the Federated Authentication SSO using SAML. Is the connection still okay?
It's still cutting in and out, so I might be tempted to kick the kids off their devices again.
Okay, hang on, I'm texting them again.
Charly, I just have a quick question.
Yes.
What's the difference in human English? What's the difference between delegated? Sorry, what does delegated authentication look like compared to federated authentication?
Gemma, give me a minute. I am going to move locations. I know this is, I'm disconnecting my screens. I don't know what you guys can see now.
That's fine. We can see all your stuff.
Okay.
So maybe while you're moving, maybe Andy, would you mind coming off mute? Would you be able to explain to the group what the differences are before we move on to the next part?
Can you hear me all right?
Thank you.
Okay, so the difference between delegated authentication and federated SAML authentication is that delegated authentication, you're really passing off responsibility for the authentication to a third-party system. The main difference is that you are actually passing real usernames and passwords across the wire to a web service that you have to create and configure, and then your web service can do whatever it needs to do. So your web service could look up the user information, the username and password that you passed across in a LDAP database, in Active Directory, in a SQL database, whatever it happens to be, and your web service just returns true or false. Do I log them in or do I not log them in? And then the Salesforce will take whatever that is and log them into Salesforce. So you're really making it so users still go to the login.salesforce.com to actually log into Salesforce, and it's just passing off their credentials to that custom web service that you have to create. It's a lot more work usually because you are responsible for the authentication service. It's honestly not as common anymore in the ecosystem. Charlie, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you summed it up really well. The go-to standard is using SAML because it makes it so easy. As you said, it's really kind of hard work to set up delegated authentication. SAML, with the SAML protocol, it makes it easy to exchange that information between the services.
It's also more secure. And the reason I say that is you are not passing credentials over the wire. So when you're logging into a SAML IDP, you're actually logging into a page owned by the IDP versus a page owned by Salesforce. So that is another major difference.
Absolutely.
Okay, there's a question. So Melissa says, why would you ever not use federated authentication?
Charlie, do you want me to take that or you want to take it?
Yes, you can take it. Sorry.
Okay.
I wasn't...
So why would I not use federated authentication? If you can't use federated authentication, then you would have to look for other options. So in general, yes, federated authentication is absolutely your go-to approach. If you need to look at delegated authentication, reasons you might need to do that is you're integrating with some old website, custom website that was built way back and doesn't have the ability to talk via SAML. Maybe you are trying to build a client. This was kind of a legacy use case, but remember the old Salesforce Mobile before Salesforce One didn't support SAML. So if you wanted to use SSO, you had to use delegated authentication. Any clients, any third-party systems that don't support browser-based redirection, which is what you need for SAML, you can still use with delegated authentication. So the old BlackBerry app, the old data loader before it supported SAML, that was another reason why you might use delegated authentication. But in general, you don't use it all that often anymore.
So, hey, Andy, this is Raj. I can give you one example of where we were not able to use the SAML, but we had to use the delegated authentications. So in a scenario where I was at a client side where we had to develop a custom security adapter, which is, like Andy said, it's a very old mechanism where they develop a custom adapter using C++, and we could use the SAML. So we had to basically use the delegated authentication to pass the user ID and password just for authentication purposes.
Okay, thank you. Charlie, do you want to move on?
Yes, yes. Thank you for the help, Andy. Okay, am I more audible now?
Yeah, you're all good. Thank you.
I'm in my kitchen. Okay, so how does single sign-on work? So these are one of my crazy drawings. So I try to make it logical, but it's single sign-on, so bear with me. So these are us. See, it's a nice lady. We go to a custom domain for Salesforce. And the word custom domain I've capitalized because that is one of the key components of setting up single sign-on. So we open our browser and we request in the URL, we put in the custom domain for Salesforce. What happens, Salesforce then sees that there's SSO request that has been set up for that domain, and it generates a SAML request. So there we go. It's hit the domain and it sees this SAML SSO request and it generates the SAML request. It redirects the SAML request back to the browser. And what does the browser do with it? The browser then redirects the SAML request to the external identity provider. That's the IDP over here. The identity provider then verifies the user's identity and packages that assertion containing the user authentication. If you weren't logged into the IDP at that stage, it would ask you to log in again. Then the identity provider sends the SAML assertion to the browser. And the browser redirects the assertion to Salesforce. Salesforce then verifies the assertion and the user is now logged in and is redirected to the page that they requested. So it's kind of easy, but it was really important what Andy said is it's about browser redirection. It's basically just requests and a search that's sent through the browser from Salesforce to the IDP. IDP verifies it, sends it back to the browser, and the browser gives it to Salesforce, and Salesforce accepts it, it recognizes it, and it logs you in. Any questions on, any comments or questions on this one? It's really kind of simple once you think about it. So what I wanted to do now is I wanted to go show you in real life how this works. So I have to log out first. So all of you know, for those of you that don't, I work for Deloitte. And we are Salesforce.com end users. And I'm on my Deloitte laptop at the moment. So what I would do is if I wanted to access Salesforce, I could just click on an icon or I can go to the my domain, and our my domain is deloitteforce.my.salesforce.com. Oh, I have to log out. But in that split second, when it redirected it, it actually, I didn't put in my username and password. It actually sent the request to Salesforce. Salesforce recognized an SSO request. It redirected that request through the browser to Deloitte's IDP. And IDP verified it's me, sent it back to my browser gave it to Salesforce, and I was logged into. So I'm going to log out again. And I'm going to close my browser and open a new window. I did test this beforehand, by the way. So I'm just going to go my.salesforce.com. And it keeps on logging me in. I'm not sure why it's not forgetting me. But that is what happens.
Charlie, have you got a demo org? Maybe try with a demo.
Say that again, Jim.
Maybe try with a demo org or a different browser.
Yeah, demo org won't work if we don't have
okay.
A single sign-on set up there. Let me try here. I've logged into this from all browsers. I might be logged out here. Oh, I've never seen this before.
That was a typo, yeah.
Salesforce, oh, okay. my.salesforce.com. Okay, that's my Deloitte IDP sign-in page. So I'm not signed in. The request was sent to Salesforce. Salesforce recognizes an SSO request. It sent that SAML request through the browser to the Deloitte IDP as it's set up in the single sign-on settings. The Deloitte IDP saw I wasn't signed in, so it's asking me to verify myself. So I'm logging in with my Deloitte credentials. I'm signing in, and now the IDP is verifying, yes, we know who Charly is and her password works. So it's sending that SAML assertion. I'm asserting that I know who she is, sending it back to the browser. The browser is giving it to Salesforce. Salesforce says, oh yes, we know who she is. We accept your verification and we are logging her in. And here I am in Salesforce. It's really magic. And as I said previously, we do this every day, so many times, that it's become such a big part of our world. And this is how it happens in the back end. And it's lightning fast, especially if you've done it a few times, then a lot of the pages and the images get cached. Any questions on this? Okay, so that was my live demo. So how do we set it up? So there's an incredible Trailhead module on how to set it up. The information in this Trailhead module used to not be in Trailhead. It was in the resource guide previously. So I want to just walk through. We're not going to do this. We don't have enough time, but I want us to just walk through this, and you can see the different components. And then hopefully after the study session, you guys will get on it and finish this module, and you would have done single sign-on yourself. So one of the important things to do is you have to have an IDP. In this Trailhead, there's an IDP set up on Heroku that does all the IDP functionality. So the first step that we're doing in our Salesforce org is making sure there's a federation ID. Now, what is the federation ID? The federation ID is the unique, comparable ID that the IDP will be able to understand and match to. So my federation ID in the Deloitte IDP is my Deloitte email address. Is usually in the form of an email address. But in order for this to work, in Salesforce, each user that needs to access single sign-on needs to have a federation ID created on their user record. So first you'll set up the federation ID, then you'll go into Salesforce and you'll set up the single sign-on provider. So here, this link opens the identity provider that's set up in Heroku for these. And there's a couple of cool tools in here, so it's worth spending some time on the site and playing around with it. So you have to first get an identity provider certificate from the IDP. And that's what you come and do here first. You get the certificate and you keep it safe. Then you're going to load it into your Salesforce once you've started setting up your single sign-on. Now, something to remember, if single sign-on is enabled in your production org and you then create your sandboxes, single sign-on will not be enabled in your sandboxes, and you have to go and enable it in the settings. So using the quick find and setup, go to single sign-on settings and you will enable SAML, and you will then set up a new single sign-on record by clicking the new button and filling in information. So this is where you're saying my IDP is, or this is my single sign-on name. And if you're planning to give the users the ability on your Salesforce login page to either log in with Salesforce credentials or with their identity provider credentials, then that is the name that's going to show on that login page. So make sure you name it something appropriate. Your issuer would be your IDP and your IDP URL. They would provide it for you. You would then upload your identity provider certificate. So there's actually 3 ways how you can create this record. You can either create it manually by filling in the information, or you can do it by uploading SAML metadata. So your IDP provider should be able to give you a downloaded SAML metadata, which you can just import, and this record will be pre-populated. Or now these days, your IDP can provide you with a SAML metadata URL. And then all you have to do is, when you create the single sign-on record, is say, import metadata from URL, click the button, paste the URL, and the SAML settings record will automatically be created. If you do this, you have to first go create the that URL for the IDP metadata as a remote site setting. If you don't, you'll get a really ugly red warning saying this should be set up as a remote site setting. And then you'll remember this conversation and you'll think, oh, why didn't I do it? So first go set it up as a remote site, and then you can use the import the SAML single sign-on settings via a metadata URL. So then you will continue to provide the different attributes to set up your single sign-on. So the name, that's what's shown on the login page. It automatically generates the API name. SAML single sign-on in Salesforce is 2.0. The issuer is your IDP URL, and your identity ID is your org's domain. Now, what I've seen, and I've done it before, is when I get here, I say, oh, I know what it is, and I type it in. It's much better to go and copy and paste it, because it's easy to make a mistake, and then your SAML doesn't want to work, and it takes you forever to troubleshoot. You then have to have a signing certificate. You could use a self-signed cert. So in Salesforce, you can go to the certificates section in setup and create self-signed cert. That works just as efficiently. And then you have to say what the encryption method is. So you have two different types, as far as I can remember, and it will depend on the encryption enforced by your IDP. There's a couple of other settings. So if you use the Federation ID, then you would tick the Federation ID. It depends on how your IDP stores the Federation or the identity type, whether it's in the name ID or whether it is in the Federation ID. And that you specify here. Sorry, the second one is for the IDP, where in the SAML assertion will we find it. And this one is which piece of information on the Salesforce user record will we use to match when we get the SAML assertion from the IDP. And then make sure you get the correct request binding. The majority that I've worked with before has been HTTP post. So make sure from your IDP that you know what that is. And then you save. So you've set up single sign-on in Salesforce. You then have to download. Once you've saved this record, you will get a button that says download metadata. You have to download that metadata and provide it to your IDP. Your IDP has to then import that metadata so that the IDP will recognize the SAML request when it comes from Salesforce through the browser. And this you will see in this trailhead, where you actually get to work with the IDP and complete the setup in the IDP as well. So once you've finished the setup in Salesforce, and once the setup is finished in the IDP, you can now test that it all works together correctly. How do you test it? One of the easiest things is to go to your domain. Type in your domain and see whether you get redirected to the IDP. That is the first catch-all to see whether you've set it up correctly. If, for example, the metadata hasn't been uploaded into the IDP, it'll give you an error. You'll probably be redirected to the IDP page, but it will say, we do not recognize this request. So that's the first place. Now, the other place you can make sure it works, especially if users start complaining, listen, I can't log in. The first thing you do is go to that user's login history. And in the login history, it will tell you a lot of information of what happened during that request. You will then get the SAML response as well, which you can take and you can put it into the SAML assertion validator tool. I think that's the right name for it. The Salesforce SAML validator, and you can paste that SAML assertion into the SAML validator tool, and it will give you some results. So this was when I did a test a little while ago. I actually found it in my emails, and there was a problem with the timestamps. Now that's also very important to remember. Salesforce only allows 3 minutes of clock skew between Salesforce, your computer, and the IDP. So make sure that the time settings are correct on all the actors in your SSO flow. So sorry, I jumped around the slides. So I was talking about this, how do I test and troubleshoot it? Go to your domain, see if it redirects, and then test the SAML assertions using the SAML validator tool. Where is the SAML validator tool? It's on that single sign-on settings page in Salesforce where you've configured the single sign-on configuration. And it's very robust. It gives you really a nice indication of where to start the troubleshooting. From my experience, it's usually either because the user doesn't have a federation ID, or there's a spelling error on the federation ID, or clock skew, or the IDP hasn't uploaded the single sign-on metadata from Salesforce, so it doesn't recognize the requests coming in. I'm going to take a breath and ask if there are any questions. None? Could everybody still hear
We
me?
have a question in the chat from Sean, which is, can you have users log on without using SSO? Do they go to login.salesforce.com, or do you use a different subdomain?
No, you when you enable single sign-on, the best practice is always to use a custom domain. So when you've configured single sign-on, you would go to your My Domain settings, and there's a section on the My Domain settings that talks about the authentication login screen. And here you can specify on the Salesforce login screen what options should be available. So your users could either on that screen log in with either their Salesforce credentials or their enterprise credentials through the single sign-on.
The other
It's
thing
probably worth mentioning as well that you could use another Salesforce org as an IDP.
Yes.
So, Charlie, one more thing to mention on that question about logging in without SSO, especially for admins. Let's say that you have configured your login page to automatically redirect, so you turned off the standard login capability. You can just put /login in the address bar on the end of your My Domain, and it'll take you to the standard login page and let you log in.
Okay. I've never tried that. Let me try that.
It's
Great
a great
tip.
tip.
So we say my login.
Yeah, put in your My Login and do, sorry, so my.salesforce.com/ do !login.
So !login, like that?
Yep.
Ah, okay.
Ooh.
I didn't know that. Or I can log in using Deloitte SSO ADFS. And if I do that, it'll redirect me to the IDP. That's so clever. Thank you for that.
Ooh.
If you've never set up a password because you're using SAML all the time.
Yes.
Yeah, it's actually a backdoor. So Raj is pointing this out as well. So it's actually a security flaw that Salesforce is aware of, that what if you only want to allow people to use SAML SSO and you never want them to log in with the Salesforce login? Well, what I just showed you is a backdoor, because you can always hit forgot your password, and then you're going to get a password for Salesforce. You won't have to use SSO. So there's a workaround for that, but you actually have to enable delegated authentication. So you turn on delegated authentication, you send it to a null provider, and then you assign the is single sign-on enabled permission to any users that you want to prevent them from logging in with anything but a SAML SSO flow. It's not documented anywhere, but it's the only way to do it.
Wow. Can you make us a slide?
Sure. Yeah.
and then it becomes part of our study. Now it's documented.
Yep, I can do that.
Thank you very much.
You're not going to get us into trouble, are you?
No, it's
No. Salesforce knows this. Like, support will tell you this, but they don't have it documented anywhere in the documentation.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on, and that's the end of the trailhead as well. Then you just make sure everything's done, and then that's congratulations. So for me, single sign-on has always been a really complicated thing. I couldn't get my head around it because I got confused between OAuth and SAML. And once I understood that, now combined with actually knowing how single sign-on works and having done it, it becomes much clearer. So there's one more portion we need to talk about, and that is about service provider initiated single sign-on versus identity provider initiated single sign-on. And it is exactly what it says it is. If I'm logging in from my identity provider and not my service provider, like I do with my Deloitte laptop, that is IDP initiated login. I confuse myself. If I'm doing this wrong, stop me. And service provider is with you. Start with your service
means
provider.
that you've logged. Sorry.
No, go for it.
So that means, so in the IDP initiated example, you've logged into your Deloitte laptop, and then you visit your bookmarked of login.salesforce.com. Then you're redirected to Deloitte's single sign-on page, Deloitte login page, or are you already logged in?
Yes.
Okay, so you're redirected. There's the assertion that logs you in, and then off you go.
So if you go to Salesforce first, if you go to the resource, so we should define service provider, right?
That's
service provider is the thing you're trying to log into. So if you go to Salesforce first and it redirects you, that is service provider initiated.
Okay.
If you go to your IDP first, and usually you'll see this where they have like the little either tabs or chiclets, things like that, where you log into your IDP and then you can choose all your apps that you can log into. That's IDP initiated. There's no redirect in an IDP initiated flow.
Cool. So if you think of it like as if it's Google Apps,
yep, that would be one way. Or if you're using Salesforce as an IDP and you're using App Launcher would be the way that you initiate IDP initiated SAML flows. So like if you logged in, take Salesforce as an example, they log into org62, they go to their app launcher and they can log into Workday, they can log into Google, they can log into all these other applications just by clicking a link. And that is IDP initiated SAML.
That's a good example. I like that example. I can remember that. Because I also remember there's a lot of questions in the exam over giving you a scenario and then saying, is this IDP initiated or service provider initiated? And it's easy to get confused if it's not really clear in your head.
I think there's another component to that is Salesforce, I think, is one system that can act at both, being service provider as well as the consumer of the service. So essentially, it could be centrally IDP to log you in and handle all your apps and app launcher. And then they can also be logged in as AD, right? So you can have your corporate identity provider accessing you to Salesforce, but then Salesforce can also act as an IDP. So it could be both, which could be very complicated kind of a SSO case.
Yes, and I think I can demonstrate that. So with service provider initiated login, I would go to Deloitte Force, there's a redirection happening and I'm logged in, right? So I started at the service provider. So this was service provider initiated SSO. Now, if I go to my app launcher, and if one of my apps, and I know there is one and I don't know what it is, if one of them are an external application like Workday, and I click on it, then Salesforce is the IDP and it's redirecting me to the service provider, so then it's IDP initiated login. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that.
You should also probably point out that that diagram that you showed originally, that is service provider initiated SAML. IDP looks significantly different.
That's right. That's right.
Okay,
And
I've got a challenge for you then, Charlie. As you're going for the board, can you draw us an IDP initiated login?
not right now, no. I'll throw the challenge back at you, Gemma. And wait.
Oh, do you know?
You
I
see,
think you could find all these diagrams in Salesforce documentation. Where there is a couple of good articles around SSO and OAuth where they go through great detail, and they have the diagrams of both federated SSO authenticated, whereas IDP initiated as well as service provider initiated diagrams. So you don't actually have to think of it yourself. You can copy it.
You will need to think of it yourself if you're thinking of going for the board. You'll be expected to draw it.
Yeah, they made me draw freehand on the whiteboard service provider initiated SAML in the context of a user agent OAuth flow for a mobile app.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
I really want them to ask me that.
so what I will promise to do is when everybody's not watching me, I will draw the IDP initiated SSO and include it in the deck, and then we can upload it back. So I promise to do that slide. And we have a promise that Andy's going to do us a backdoor slide.
So Charlie, this is Raj. Hey, the example you highlighted, accessing the Workday from Salesforce.
From my app launcher, yes.
From your app launcher, I think that works more like OAuth, right? That you basically create a trust between two apps. I'm not sure.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're kind of right, because remember, OAuth is about authorization. So if I had an object, for example, in my Salesforce, and it was using information from Workday, but it's not actually logging me into Workday and redirecting me to Workday,
Right.
then I could use OAuth to go fetch that data and show it to me in Salesforce. But if I click on a link and it actually opens Workday in a new browser and I get automatically logged into Workday, that automatically log into Workday and see Workday is single sign-on. Because OAuth is just a temporary authorization to access data on a different service from one service. Does that make sense?
It's important to remember, so even if that's an app that you're accessing from Salesforce, it's still authenticated through your ADFS, isn't it? Because that's your repository for users.
This is definitely a hypothetical. You could configure this any number of ways. I think in the example that Charlie gave, AD is acting as the IDP for Salesforce, and Salesforce is acting as the IDP for other third-party apps like Workday.
Yes.
That's the only way that it would be IDP initiated from Salesforce is in that scenario. You could just have a link to Workday, and it be service provider initiated, and it's using the same IDP that Salesforce is, going back to whether it's ADFS or Ping or Okta or whatever. But you really can't know just by looking at it. You'd have to dig into the configuration. But in the scenario that Charlie laid out, that would be IDP initiated from Salesforce.
Okay.
Yeah. where Salesforce is
that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let me see what slides I have left. I don't think much, and we've only got a couple of minutes left. So how do we set it? Go do this trailhead. It's real magic to build it the first time. How do I test and troubleshoot it?
Cool trailhead. Definitely helps you to ingrain the knowledge, because you actually get a chance to set it up, and it's like it's a different IDP. So it's really, really good.
And then I've got a couple of best practices here. We've spoken about most of them. We talked about getting the Salesforce login URL from the settings configuration page. We talked about the clock skew. We talked about going to check the login history and note the error message so that you can start troubleshooting any issues. We talked about the federation ID or your org internal usernames and Salesforce usernames. Make sure that they correspond and map them. You have to enable the SAML org preference. Use the My Domain feature. If you want to test this and you're not sure, don't do this in production. Use a developer edition account or a sandbox. Yes, don't do this in production. And when you create sandbox copies, they are made with federated authentication with SAML disabled. You have to go enable it, even if it's enabled in your production. And your identity provider must allow you to set the service provider's audience URL. We've touched on most of them throughout the course today. So they all should make sense for you. And then the next steps is build it. Go build it. Build it using Trailhead. Ask your employer if you can implement it, even if it's just in a sandbox. It's really interesting when you're in the weeds and you're trying to figure out, because each IDP is different as well, if Salesforce is not your IDP. So there are so many different nuances that you have to troubleshoot. It really becomes interesting, and that's when a lot of these settings and attributes and, oh, that checkbox, yes, that's what it does. That's when it really starts to make a lot of sense. And then the last slide was the exam resource guide. I found 1 or 2 Quizlets that contains SSO information, the trail mix I spoke about, and there has been, I probably found 7 single sign-on Dreamforce sessions when I Googled it, and I've put them all in a link for you guys. So I'm going to hand it over to Gemma for the thank yous and what happens next.
Okay. Thank you so much, Charlie. I actually think this is probably one of the best sessions that we've had so far. It's been really interactive and it's been fantastic as well. Thank you to all the boys who joined the session to help us, and to you know, it's been sessions and some real life examples shared. So I just wanted to say a very special thank you to everybody who has come along to support the content. If you're not already in our group, please do come and join our community group. Visit our website. We've got a few things that pop up all the time. So today we just posted another story. But also we're really interested in hearing about your stories. If you have been, you know, conceptually touched by what we're trying to do, then we would love to hear about you, your story, why you're following on the architect or designer certs path, just to understand who you are and, you know, what we can do to support you. We also have a survey that we've put out. We're going to get together and have a planning session with Susanna. She's had to drop, but we're going to be sorting that out in the next couple of weeks. But to do that, we would really like to hear from you about things that you would like to see us do over the next year. So if you are able to just spend a couple of minutes and give us some feedback, there is a survey that's been posted on our website. So please do come along and support us with next year's planning. Thank you. Andy's just put a final note. So he said IDP initiated doesn't support deep linking top apps. Oh, and thank you for the feedback, Sean. Appreciate it. I'm going to sign off now because it's 11 o'clock in the UK and I need my beauty sleep. Thank you so much to everybody for coming. Charlie, as ever, you've done an amazing job. Thank you very much. And we'll post this up on YouTube. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye. Yes, I think that was a great session, right, Gemma?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's what study groups are all about. We don't have to know everything because we have to study together.
Yeah.
Hey, Chris.